So, picture this. It's 2022 and we're right in the middle of a really brutal, worsening cost of living crisis for everyday households. People are struggling just to pay for basic heating and groceries. And meanwhile, the average CEO of a top UK company was pulling in around £3.91 million, which is just a staggering number to even try and contextualise. I mean, that's 118 times the salary of an average worker. And it was a 16% increase from the previous year, hitting a 5-year high. Now, you think the shareholders, the literal owners of these companies, who basically just demand profit above all else, you'd think they'd be thrilled with these wealthy, ruthless executives driving up numbers, as this pay increase was based on growth in company returns. But they weren't. In fact, a lot of shareholders were furious. That reaction actually exposes a massive flaw in how most of us understand corporate behaviour. We tend to think of business as this really simple machine, like you put money in, you get money out. But the reality is a highly complex, really messy political ecosystem. And that's exactly why we're here. Welcome to this episode of The Strategy Show. Our mission today is to completely shatter a very common myth, the idea that companies exist solely to make money for their owners. We're going to explore this strategic tool called the Mendelow Power Interest Matrix, which sounds intense, but is actually quite fascinating. And we'll look at exactly how these invisible power structures basically dictate what a corporation actually does on a daily basis. Now, let's unpack this. For decades, there was one golden rule of business: keep the owners rich and everything is fine. But modern management theory typically rejects that now as being far too simplistic. Instead, most theorists tend to argue that a company's goals actually reflect the power and the interests of its most powerful stakeholder groups. Now, before we go any further, we need to define what a stakeholder actually is, because it's a word that gets thrown around a lot in corporate jargon. It's a broad term, but essentially, a stakeholder is any group or even just a single person that has an interest in what an organisation does. So basically, anyone who cares. But what makes this strategic framework so useful is how we categorise those groups, because they break down into 3 distinct types. We have internal, we have connected, and we have external. Let's look at the internal stakeholders first. That's your employees and your managers. They're intimately tied to the daily operations, partly because their personal goals are tied to the company's goals, keeping their jobs, getting a promotion, paying their mortgages. They want the organisation to survive and grow. Then you have the connected stakeholders. These are the shareholders, the customers, the suppliers, the finance providers like banks. They don't work inside the company day to day, but they supply absolutely vital resources, capital, sales revenue, raw materials, and if they leave, the whole thing shuts down. And then sitting way on the outside, you have the external stakeholders. So these are groups that are outside the organisation, but unlike connected stakeholders, they don't have a formal legal or contractual relationship with the company. So these would be groups like the local community or the government or pressure groups. Like we said, they don't have a direct financial connection to the daily operations. They're not buying the products or writing the loans, but they influence the entire context of the organisation. Like if the government passes a sweeping new regulation, everyone has to adjust what they do. Now, to add complexity to this mess of stakeholders who have an interest in our organisation, there's a core tension across all these different groups, and that is that they naturally want different things. You see conflicts occurring between groups all the time. Employees want a pay rise to keep up with inflation, which directly reduces the profit margins available for shareholders. It's a zero-sum game in that specific moment. But what's even wilder is that you see intense conflict within the groups themselves. Take shareholders as an example. You might have a family who founded a business generations ago, and they still hold a huge block of shares. Now, they probably care deeply about the company's 100-year legacy, its reputation in their hometown, keeping the local factory workers employed. But Sitting right next to them at the board meeting as a co-owner is a massive institutional investor, like a hedge fund or a pension company. And that pension company just wants to see a massive spike in their quarterly dividend so they can satisfy their own clients. So, they're both technically connected stakeholders, they're both shareholders, but their goals are completely opposed. Now, this idea of conflict brings us right back to that big statistic from the beginning of this session, the CEO pay crisis. Because when these interests collide on a massive scale, the fallout is huge. Now, this crisis is a perfect illustration of how the goals of internal stakeholders, the executives, can absolutely infuriate connected stakeholders, the shareholders. Remember that the average FTSE 100 CEO pay hit £3.9 million in 2022. That's a 16% jump in 1 year, while the average household couldn't afford their heating. And the backlash was just incredibly severe from customers, the public, financial think tanks, and from shareholders themselves. Now, that might seem a bit odd for shareholders to be part of this backlash, because if I'm a shareholder, right, and my CEO is making millions of pounds, wouldn't that usually mean the company's highly profitable and doing really well, which is why the CEO is getting paid so much? So why are the shareholders the ones leading the activism here? Shouldn't they be thrilled that the CEO is, ruthless enough to drive up the stock price? It's a really logical question, and honestly, it's where the nuance of stakeholder theory really shines. Because we assume that shareholders just want maximum profit at any cost, right? The issue was that disproportionate CEO pay, particularly during a time of widespread economic hardship, actively erodes public trust in business. So it becomes a severe reputational risk that threatens the company's actual long-term survival. Shareholders viewed this widening pay gap not as a fair reward for the company's financial success, but more as a symptom of really poor corporate governance. Because if management's just padding their own pockets while the rest of the country suffers, then apart from anything, it acts as a magnet for government regulation. It invites the external stakeholders to come in and attack. Pressure groups, the media, politicians. So perceived excessive pay is actually a leading cause of shareholder dissatisfaction, because some of the shareholders realise that the internal executives are prioritising their own personal wealth over the long-term stability of the whole entity. Now, this leads to this massive strategic problem. When all these groups are clashing, like when employees want higher pay, the executives want a bonus, the bank wants its interest, the customer wants a cheaper product, the shareholders want more dividends, how does a company actually decide who to listen to? That brings us to the ultimate kind of corporate cheat sheet, which is the Mendelow power interest matrix. Mendelow suggests that you can't simply treat all your stakeholders equally. It's a waste of resources, and quite frankly, it's impossible. So you map them onto a simple grid. How does this grid work? Well, the axes are very straightforward. You have power ranging from low to high, and you have level of interest in the organization's activities, also from low to high. Now, how do we decide on where a stakeholder goes on each of these axes? Well, if we look at power first of all, this is trying to see how much control the stakeholder can have over our business and the decisions we're taking. The problem is the level of power of a stakeholder can be considered from lots of different angles. You might have stakeholders who have a great deal of legal power over the decisions you make, like the government who can pass laws that your company has to follow. Or shareholders who own the company and have a legal right to vote on whether they think the board are doing the right thing or not. But organizations have other stakeholders that can still wield a great deal of power. You might have skilled staff who would be hard to replace and who have knowledge and abilities that you need to operate. And if we can't afford to let them leave, then they have power over us. We might have key customers who wield financial power over us, suppliers who provide materials we can't easily find from anywhere else. The list goes on. If someone has the ability to disrupt our operations or significantly impact our finances in some way in particular, then that will give them a high degree of power. The second axis on Mendelow's matrix is interest. Simply put, how much is the stakeholder we're looking at likely to try and exert some influence over our organisation and its decisions? This usually depends on how much impact we have on that stakeholder. Major shareholders, for example, will have high interest because they've got a lot of money tied up in the business and they want to see it invested sensibly to earn a return. Employees may have a high interest because decisions that we take as an organisation affect their work, their pay, and their livelihoods. So for each stakeholder, we have to weigh up these two factors, power and interest, and that lets us plot them onto the matrix. Now, that means that we end up with 4 distinct segments that stakeholders could fall into within the matrix. Let's walk through them, because if you want to understand corporate politics, this is literally the map. Segment A is low power and low interest. And the strategy for these stakeholders is pretty harsh. Minimal effort is expended. If you're listening to this right now and you've ever felt completely ignored by a massive organisation that you buy products from, it's probably because someone in a boardroom mapped you into segment A. They decided that you don't care enough and you just aren't powerful enough to hurt them, so they don't waste their time. Then we move to segment B. This is stakeholders who have low power but high interest. Think of local community representatives or neighbourhood charities. They care deeply about what a local factory is doing. Maybe they're concerned about water pollution or local hiring practices. But they don't have the direct legislative or financial power to actually shut the factory down. But there's a massive warning about segment B. They have to be kept informed. You can't simply ignore them. Because even though they don't have direct power to hurt you today, their views can influence more powerful stakeholders, usually through lobbying. If you just ignore the local community group because they lack power, they might organise and go straight to the local government. And the government does have the power to shut you down. Which then perfectly transitions us to segment C. Stakeholders that have high power but low interest. This is arguably the most dangerous quadrant for any management team because it's kind of the sleeping giant. For example, large passive institutional shareholders, like those hedge funds and pensions that we talked about before. They have massive power. They might own 20% of the company's shares. But as long as the dividends keep rolling in and the share price is stable, their day-to-day interest is very low. They're largely passive. The strategy for segment C is that they have to be treated with care and kept satisfied. Because if they get unhappy, they wake up. If you anger them, their interest level shoots up and they cross the matrix into the final quadrant. Segment D. This is stakeholders with high power and high interest. We refer to them as the key players. Your corporate strategy absolutely has to be acceptable to these groups. If it isn't, they'll stop you dead in your tracks. A major irreplaceable customer might fall into this category. The government often falls into this category too when it decides to pass legislation relating to your business. And major individual shareholders are often more actively interested in the business as well, as opposed to those institutional investors we mentioned before. Let's try and ground this in reality and see how it actually plays out. Imagine a company called Clean Sweep, a company that makes cleaning products in the UK. 70% of their total output is sold to just one single supermarket company called Big Mart. Now, 70% of your sales to one buyer, that's massive dependency. On top of that, let's say Clean Sweep's workforce is largely unskilled and, crucially, they're not unionised. If you were the management team of Clean Sweep and you're sitting in a boardroom mapping this out on Mendelow's matrix, the question is, where do the different stakeholder groups sit? Well, first up, Big Mart, the store buying 70% of the products that we sell. That is solidly in segment D. They have massive power because they're the main source of our revenue, meaning that if they leave, the disruption is potentially fatal, and the replacement criteria is terrible for Clean Sweep. Now, they obviously have a high interest as well in the price and the quality of the products that we sell. They're the key player. So our management as Clean Sweep has to be to really bend over backwards to do whatever Big Mart wants. And what about the employees who are making our product? Where are they on the map? Well, the workforce is stuck way down in segment A or B. We assume that they have high interest in keeping their jobs and getting paid, obviously, but because they're unskilled and non-unionized, they have incredibly low power. So they could be easily replaced. Now, this means that they can't cause meaningful disruption. So management are likely going to expend minimal effort keeping them happy, prioritizing all the demands of more powerful stakeholders like Big Mart. Now, this raises an incredibly important point about how management actually uses this map, because it isn't just a static snapshot of the present, it changes constantly. Stakeholder mapping is a dynamic tool that's used to establish political priorities and actually to try and manipulate the board. It may be appropriate to seek to reposition certain stakeholders or actively discourage others from repositioning themselves. Because here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when a company gets this map wrong? Or what happens when the map suddenly shifts beneath their feet? It can cause total panic. I mean, let's take Clean Sweep again. Say that the unskilled workforce in segment B, low power, high interest, gets fed up with being ignored and they decide to unionize. Suddenly, overnight, they gain collective control of strategic resources, which is their labour. They march right across the matrix, out of segment A or B, and straight into segment D. They become key players. Or to bring it back to our earlier real-world example of the CEO pay crisis, think about what happens when a community group or a think tank down in segment B starts a massive public relations campaign about wealth inequality. Yeah, they don't have the power to change the CEO's pay themselves, but they suddenly convince a segment C group, those sleepy, high-powered institutional investors, to wake up, have a look at the CEO's compensation, and realize it's a massive reputational risk, that the passive giant wakes up and attacks. That's genuinely terrifying for a CEO. So part of good stakeholder management is always trying to anticipate the next move. If you know that you need to implement a risky new business strategy, look at your map and ask, who is in segment D that's going to try and block this? How can I satisfy them or strategically reduce their power? Are there any groups in other segments of my matrix who may kind of react to my changes and potentially grab more power? It's literally a high stakes game of chess. You're constantly trying to keep the sleeping giants in segment C satisfied so they don't wake up and join the key players in segment D to fire you. You're trying to make sure that people in segment B, for example, don't try and influence these other more powerful groups to again cause you problems. It really changes how you consume business news, doesn't it? Every time a massive corporation issues like a weirdly defensive PR statement, or suddenly caves into a union demand after months of fighting, or suddenly just abruptly fires a highly profitable CEO, you're not just seeing random corporate chaos, you're seeing an underlying structure. Basically, you're watching the Mendelow matrix play out in real time. You're seeing a management team realize in an absolute panic that somebody's coordinate has just shifted from a low power to a high power. And that's really the crucial takeaway from all of this strategic analysis. Critical thinking is absolutely essential when we look at business and about kind of stakeholder management in particular. True strategy isn't just about crunching numbers on a spreadsheet or optimizing a supply chain or designing a slightly better vacuum cleaner. True strategy is about managing human conflict. It's about understanding the nature of dependency, recognizing who holds the resources that you need to survive, and having the foresight to know exactly when a passive stakeholder might be waking up. Which brings us right back to you, the listener. You're not just a passive consumer scanning a barcode at the self-checkout, and you're not just an employee clocking in and out. You are a stakeholder. You have a very specific calculable coordinate on the Mendelow matrix, for every single company that you interact with. Sometimes, yes, you're stuck in segment A with me, with low power and low interest. But sometimes, especially if you organize with other customers or vote with other employees or rally your community members, you can force your dot to move across the map. You can shift into segment B, or if you get lucky, segment D. The tools of management are ultimately also the tools of observation. Once you understand exactly how these massive organizations measure your power, you understand how to exert it. Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder today. Because if Mendelow's matrix is all about a company predicting who has the power to help or hurt them, what happens when a massive, arrogant corporation completely misjudges its own position on the board? What happens when a company acts like it's on the absolute command side of the relationship spectrum, dictating terms to everyone, only to realize far too late that the stakeholders actually hold all the cards? Basically, the whole ecosystem collapses. Think about any iconic brands that have just vanished overnight because they thought they were invincible, entirely forgetting who provided, their sunlight and their water in the first place. This whole thing, when we look at stakeholder analysis, is a delicate ecosystem, and that the gravity is always shifting between different groups. Thanks to everyone listening for joining us on this episode. I hope you found it useful and hopefully interesting. If you have been listening, remember to follow us so you get notified of future episodes as they drop. See you next time.